Thanks so much, everyone, for joining the session today. It's a really interesting topic that I'm going to be talking about, which is responsible introduction of innovation into the clinical setting. And I want to premise my talk on a real-life example of a fertility application and some of the issues that are kind of persistent across the areas of introducing innovation into the clinical setting, and how trust plays a huge role into that introduction. So my name is Michelle Perugini. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Presagen. We're an AI healthcare company in women's health, and we have a really advanced AI platform that connects clinics, patients, and medical data from around the world to drive AI-enhanced healthcare. Really exciting time for AI in the healthcare sector, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing, but the example that I'll describe today that's actually in clinical use at the moment is our Life Whisperer products, which are around AI-enhanced fertility, really using artificial intelligence to be able to drive better outcomes for IVF patients around the world. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're doing first, and then I can go into some of the aspects of trust and some of the challenges that I see with respect to introducing clinical innovation into clinical use and into clinical workflows, and how we overcome some of those barriers for new technology. So Life Whisperer is a really interesting application of artificial intelligence. It's around utilising images of a patient's embryos as they go through the IVF process to be able to help doctors to decide which of those embryos are most likely to lead to a pregnancy, which embryos are the highest quality, and which embryos should they transfer to the patient first. It is interesting technology because it's taking just a single image of an embryo after fertilization to be able to utilize advanced artificial intelligence that has been trained on tens of thousands of historical cases of embryos that have been transferred and for which we know the pregnancy outcomes. And so the AI has essentially learnt the features of those embryos that relate to the quality of the embryo, and therefore the likelihood that that embryo will achieve a pregnancy. And we've also got a second application that takes that same image of the embryo and helps to determine the likelihood that that embryo is genetically normal just from a single image of the embryo, which is quite amazing. And then, of course, the doctors use that to be able to inform their decisions about which embryo to transfer for the patient. It's completely objective and accurate, quite accurate. It's easy to use, simple drag and drop of images onto the system. Very cost effective, both for patients and also the clinics. And it's non-invasive. So we're talking about technology here that is, improving the clinical decisioning within the IVF lab without any actual physical intervention to the embryo itself, and causing no harm there. So AI in healthcare is a really interesting industry, and there's so many different kind of market sizing values around at the moment about how big the actual market is for AI in healthcare. But one of the staggering statistics that I've seen is around the health economic returns that can be generated and achieved through artificial intelligence. It's about fivefold of the market size. And so what's interesting about this is that AI has so much value to add from the perspective of not only clinical decision support, but also creating efficiency gains within the clinical environment, improving patient outcomes, being able to drive some of the core improvements that we see in what is quite a conservative and traditional industry. It's exciting the ways that AI is being used already in the clinical environment for clinical decision support tools like the one that I'll talk about today. Therapeutics, being able to shorten the time for therapeutics to get to market and go through those testing processes through doing in silico drug development and drug design is really exciting. Personalized medicine, being able to identify really specific genetic traits that relate to a particular individual and being able to personalize that down to the individual using AI technology. Patient engagement, just really simple workflow operational improvements around text analysis of clinical notes and digitizing some of those core administrative tasks within the clinical environment. And so it's actually a really exciting industry to be operating in, and there's a huge amount of gains to be had, but there's certainly challenges in terms of implementation of many of these types of innovations. And although I'll be talking about artificial intelligence today, a lot of what I'm talking about is really relevant to any new innovation within a clinical setting. So what's holding back AI in healthcare? It's really interesting area. So AI products often don't scale, and they don't scale effectively because they require very large, diverse data sets in order to be effective, and in order to represent the right level and generality around the clinical environment and patient demographics. And if the AI is not built on the right data, it can be incredibly biased, it can be brittle, it can be unreliable, and there's many famous cases of where this has happened. Healthcare is also really heavily regulated, and this creates huge barriers for innovation, particularly new innovation where the existing regulatory frameworks don't really understand or they're not synonymous with the new ways of testing these types of innovations and technologies. And so if you boil all of this down, it really comes down to a general lack of trust, and a general lack of understanding of new technology and how to test it. And I want to unpack that a little bit today. So this is a really fun little infographic here, but what it serves to tell you is that the medical customer is incredibly scientific. They're conservative. At the end of the day, they're treating patients, and lives are at risk. And so, any innovation might be wonderful from the perspective of how it can potentially shorten, in our case, shorten the time to pregnancy for patients. That's a huge benefit. But on the other hand, there's just so much that needs to be unpacked in terms of that trust. And it's not just trust, it's about time. A lot of these clinicians are making extremely critical decisions in a time poor environment. They've got a lot of information that's available to them. They need to know what they need to integrate within their clinical workflow. They can't be adding things that add time, to their kind of consults or decisioning. It really needs to be cognizant of so many different things in terms of the clinical integration. So what they really want to know is there a specific driver for change? It's kind of that don't fix what ain't broke analogy. And what is it and how does it work? Is it easy enough for them to explain? Do they understand it well enough to be able to talk to the patients about it? Is it adding value to their clinic patient relationship and discussions? Is the technology reliable is a big one. How can they have trust and accept that technology is actually adding value to their clinical decisions to the extent that they'll be willing to introduce it into their clinical workflow and clinical practice? Now, of course, that's a little bit more relevant to clinical decision support type tools that I'll be talking about today. Things that are clinical efficiency gains are a little bit less subject to that type of adoption barrier. But I guess at the end of the day, is kind of what are the benefits? Are they real? Can I explain them? Do I trust the technology? Does it work? And, are there too many solutions that I'm trying to integrate? And can I actually work effectively with all of these solutions? So, the way that I like to view the world in terms of innovation and clinical adoption of innovation is really about aligning incentives. How can we align incentives across the clinicians and embryologists, the patients themselves, and the technology that kind of sits in the middle there and supports both of those sides? And it's actually more difficult than you might think it is. They've all got very different incentives. So, from the clinicians' point of view, and in this case, it's embryologists that I'll be talking about in terms of clinical integration of AI into the fertility sector. But clinicians have an ultimate duty to their patients. They want to achieve better patient outcomes, but they need to do it in a really constrained environment where there's time efficiency issues. They want to be putting in place things that provide operational improvements whilst creating those improved patient outcomes. For patients, there's other incentives driving them. Obviously, they want better outcomes as well, and that's where they're aligned. But they need to have access, and the technologies need to be affordable, particularly if you want to deliver innovations that are scalable and that encompass a broad range of different patient demographics. They're also interested more and more in treatment transparency. So, how is this doctor actually serving me as a patient? And can I get a window into the technologies or the approaches that are being used or the tests that are being used to be able to improve my own treatment, and patients becoming more and more discerning? And then, of course, the AI technology in this case sits in the middle. It's really, it can certainly bridge the gap between these incentives, and it can support things like clinical decision making. It can support that operational efficiency if it's used in the right way. It can increase standardization of care, and it can certainly help improve accuracy of those clinical decisions, which is really exciting. So all of the incentives there are aligned, but it's just really important to map out how technology is bridging that gap between the clinicians and the patients. So then, of course, we talk about responsible introduction of innovation and how that's premised on trust. And I think trust really underpins everything in terms of introduction of innovation, particularly into a clinical environment. But if you think about other industries, I mean, financial services is the same, heavily regulated industry. There's major trust issues there around the data and technology as well. So this is not reserved to healthcare per se, but I think it's more pronounced in the healthcare sector. So trust kind of cuts across many different areas. Data and technology, I talked a little bit about this already. How does it work, and can I explain it? Do I understand enough about the technology to be able to both trust it but also explain it if I need to explain the results in a consult to a patient? Do I trust that I can do that? Scientific and clinical validation, I mean, this is a bit of a no-brainer. This is, does the technology work, and has it been adequately tested? And there's many different ways in which new technologies and innovations get tested that are not necessarily the traditional ways that therapeutics, for example, go through the testing process. And so this can be a bit of a barrier and can cause some, mistrust issues in terms of the technology validation. Regulatory quality and data management. So this is a big one. Doesn't meet the legal requirements to be marketed. And that seems easy, but when you're talking about scalable innovations that cut across many different global locations and different markets, as well as data privacy issues, you've got quality and regulatory issues and regulatory requirements that need to be met in order to bring some of these innovations into the clinical environment. Even if they're low-risk devices, often they do require those regulatory and quality standards to be met before they can be marketed. Clinical utility. So this is a big one, and it's not so much a trust issue, but it is underpinned by trust. So does this actually solve a clinical need, and is it practical for me? I now trust that it's been built on the right data and technology. It's been validated. It's gone through all of the checks and balances, but does it actually solve my need in a way that I need it to be solving? And then, of course, the patient benefit. Will it increase access and improve outcomes for the patients? And again, that comes heavily down to the clinical validation. And do I believe that this is going to be helpful to my patients? And cost and value. So the health economics here is really important. Does the value outweigh the cost to the patient or provider? And so when you're talking about innovations like artificial intelligence, often there's, a scale advantage where you can create these technologies that can be delivered at a relatively low cost, and it can be a huge advantage in terms of the patient outcomes that can be achieved versus the cost and to provide that service to the patient, which is really exciting. So I just want to unpack those different areas a little bit. Trust in data. This is really important. There's so many different aspects. where data is very important in terms of underpinning the trust of the AI, in this case, that's being developed. There's data bias issues if the right data has not been used, if the data is not diverse enough, if it doesn't represent different clinical environments and different patient demographics, then that AI is not going to work at different clinical environments when you put it out to market, and it can be incredibly biased and subject to the data that it's been trained on. Data diversity, again, it needs to be trained on that broad data set that's representative of those different examples that it's going to see actually in the real world. Data access, this is a huge one in healthcare. So data privacy laws prevent you being able to move data between different country borders or across country borders. So it's very difficult to bring data into the one spot, into a centralized location, to be able to do anything like build an AI or train an AI. And so, as a company, we've focused a lot on these core issues around data access. How do we access those diverse data sets? How do we do that in a privacy secure way so that we're not breaching those data privacy laws, but we still get the benefit of being able to train our AI on really globally diverse data sets? So that's a very interesting area that we've spent a lot of time working in. And data quality is another one. Poor quality data can contribute to really poor performing AI models, and you need to be able to manage those data quality issues. I like this one. Explainable AI. A lot of people, a lot of companies, there's a lot of talk about explainable AI. It's a difficult it's a difficult topic to broach. The AI by nature is a massive, complex network of connections, and it's never going to be able to tell you exactly how it made the decision that it made. And that's kind of the nature and the benefit of deep learning, is that it can do that. And so we've got to be really careful when we talk about explainable AI. Of course, we're able to identify areas of an image, for example, that AI is focusing on, but we may never be able to explain exactly why it focused on that area and what the core, underpinning biological reason for that is. And so we've got to be a little bit careful about the narrative about AI and shift that narrative from how does it work to does it actually work? And does it work for my clinic and for my patients? And we need to be building these technologies responsibly so that they're based on the right type of data, so that we can test them rigorously, so that we can prove that they work. And that's very important. But explaining every intricacy around how that neural network is coming up with that decision is quite challenging. So again, it's about changing that narrative. Does it work? How does it work to does it work, and how do I explain those results? And that's where clinical validation is really important. So if we look at scientific validation, there's many ways that we can do that. There's scientific validation around publishing studies and white papers, that are peer reviewed in well-respected journals. Clinical validation for AI technology often involves many different types of trial designs: retrospective, prospective, RCT type trial designs as well, and ensuring that you've really got the right type of blind and double blind testing that's been taken place, so that you can ensure that that AI innovation that's been developed actually works in the real world, in real world clinical environments. And then, of course, continuously monitoring that the use of that particular technology in real world clinical use is the most important scientific and clinical validation that we can do. This is an interesting one. So this is, does it work for me? Is it suitable for my clinical environment? Does it work for me? There's often this case where, you've tested your innovation extensively across many different clinical environments. You've published the papers, you've run the clinical validations, you've gone through regulatory approvals, but does the technology actually work in my clinical environment? And clinics will often want to trial and test innovations, and that's completely reasonable, and they should do that because each clinical environment is quite nuanced, and they need to have an opportunity to be able to trial and test it and see that it works with them, not only from a validation perspective, but also from a clinical integration and workflow perspective. That's really important. And they need to be guided on how to do that, because a lot of these innovations are not native to them. They're very used to the traditional clinical workflows that they've been in. They don't have a lot of time. And so one of the methods that we've used is really guiding clinics through that clinical validation process, so that they can understand how to best test and measure that new innovation and understand that it's working in the way that it's intended to. So how can I then explain the results? And I think, this is a little undersold, but if you're bridging that gap between clinician and patient, and you're providing technology that is directly visible to the patient, you as a clinician have a really tough job of explaining that innovation to a patient, helping them to understand what the results mean. Why have they used it? What if the clinician disagrees with the results of the AI, and what happens in those different circumstances? And there's different ways of doing that. I mean, for us, we've created really simple patient reports that explain what the results mean, that explain, that kind of can bring together the different decision points that the clinicians use, not only the AI, but also their traditional metrics that they've used to make a particular clinical decision. And that's been really effective for us. But I think it's really important not to ignore this, because those clinicians, if they don't understand it, if they don't know how to explain it, they will not use that technology for their patient, or they'll not explain the technology adequately to the patient, and that can lead to a whole range of other challenges. And then, of course, there's the more boring aspects of trust around regulatory and quality management. Medical device regulation's really difficult. And I think there's a bit of a misnomer about technologies and innovations like artificial intelligence, that they don't need this same medical device regulation, but many of them do. Our device, Life Whisper, in the fertility sector, is a medical device, is regulated in a different way in every country in the world, anywhere from unregulated through to class 2 regulation. And there's so many different regulatory bodies to deal with. There's, the FDA, CE marking, a whole range of others. But then there's also the compliance standards around data like HIPAA and GDPR and many more. And there's some new AI standards that are coming out as well, such as the NICE framework, that are helping to set expectations around the evidence base for new innovations like AI. So it is quite a complex regulatory and quality environment in which to operate and develop these types of innovations. So, but I guess all of this is really adding to the trust element for those innovations. And it's really helpful to be meeting those standards and that level of regulatory scrutiny, because that's something that the clinical, clinicians and physicians really understand, and they respect that regulatory burden. Trust through collaboration. So this is an interesting one. When you're talking about AI technology and new innovations, what we found really helpful is collaborating with many clinics around the world and getting them involved in the actual build process, or the process of developing these AI technologies that we're bringing out to market. And collaboration's really been the key for us, not only in being able to access core data sets that we need to build the AI, but also, again, developing that trust from those organizations and clinics that are collaborating with us, because they get a window into the development process of the AI. And that's really important, because then the more they understand, the better they, the more they trust the technologies that we're developing together. They're using their own data sets. We're testing in their own clinical environments. They get to see how well the technology works. They get to be part of that scientific exploration. They get to be part of the clinical validation. And it's really important for both sides of developing that level of understanding. And cost versus value. So cost versus value is really important. The health economics equation of any technology is incredibly important to understand how much value is the technology adding versus how much cost will it add to the either clinical environment or the patient directly. So there's a lot of factors that weigh into this equation around, for the clinic, should they buy it or should they build it themselves? And, often that cost equation is really important in their decisioning about, whether they work with third-party providers of these types of innovations, whether they try and internally build them themselves. But one of the benefits of having kind of, this scalable AI solutions is that the more scalable they are, the more relevant they are to different clinical environments and different patient demographics, the lower the cost of that implementation. And so, you can offer these products at really low cost to the patient at scale, which makes it really beneficial. So I'm just going to summarize here around responsible introduction of innovation. It really is all about trust. Aligning incentives and creating trust is incredibly important for the success of any innovation, particularly in a clinical environment. Providing a scientific and clinical evidence base and validation of that innovation, whatever it may be. Every innovation will be tested in different ways, but that's incredibly important to underpin that trust equation. Balancing how it works or how does it work with showing that it actually does work is really important as well. We're not trying to necessarily, is an education element here, but we're not necessarily trying to educate them on the intricate workings of how that innovation operates. But what we're trying to do is validate that the technology does actually work. And educating clinics and patients on new technology is really important, taking the time to help them to understand at least what the results mean. How do they explain those results to patients is really important. And then mitigating key risks around data security, regulation, quality management, and ensuring that the cost finally is balanced with the value that's provided is really important. So thank you so much. I hope that's been useful, and I'm happy to open up to some questions.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for that. That was an amazing talk. I'm very fascinated by AI, and I think as a marketer myself, it's definitely I've seen a big shift in what AI is doing. One thing that you mentioned that I really really stood out to me was about how AI is there to make things more efficient, and I think in my opinion, I don't know very much about it, but I think it's like definitely helping us reduce that human error aspect of it, right? Especially in healthcare where it could be life or death.
Correct. Yeah, it's human error is a huge issue, but I think sometimes you just need multiple lines of evidence when you're making a decision. So having more information is sometimes kind of overloads clinicians, but if that information is presented in the right way, it can provide a second opinion or a second line of evidence that kind of validates their own clinical views. So I see them working very synonymously. I don't see AI being the decision maker or the diagnostic necessarily. I see it being a support tool for clinicians to be able to leverage to make those better decisions.
I see. So your company is gonna. How long have y'all been operating for? I mean, are y'all a newer startup? Because I've only heard of like maybe one other company that might be working in this field. So it's really interesting, and I applaud you. I think it's amazing work, and any way that I can be of any resource to you or your team, I'd love to. Uh, but how long have y'all been around for?
Yeah, so we've been around for nearly 5 years now.
Okay,
Yeah.
amazing. So we'll see. Let me look in the comments to see if we have any questions from the audience. If you have any questions for Dr. Michelle, please feel free to drop them in the comments. While we wait, let me ask you this one question. From an AI perspective, what is a prediction that you have for 2023 and
Oh
how it's
gosh.
going to play a role? Big picture.
Yeah, I think it's not a quick moving field. I think it's quite a challenging industry. So I don't think anything's going to happen necessarily in the short term, but I think what we are seeing is more of these technologies actually reaching the clinic, which is very exciting. But there's still all of those challenges that I mentioned and barriers to uptake. That are really important to consider. And so unfortunately, a lot of AI technology that's developed in these research organizations really never sees the light of day. They're very interesting applications, interesting algorithms that have the potential to do really great things in the clinical environment, but they're just not ready for prime time. And so that's been the challenge with AI in the healthcare space. There are huge barriers to entry, massive regulatory burden, and it's the AI needs to be built right and tested right before it can be actually utilized. So, yeah, I think we're going to see an increasing level of these or amount of these solutions reaching the market. And I think platforms or technologies like ours that can really access those diverse data sets in a privacy secure way, in a decentralized, federated way, is a really good start, because it means that we're building the technologies right for scale from day one.
So, you brought up an interesting point. Because in healthcare, obviously with HIPAA and everything, how does that play a role with AI? I mean, like, is there an extra level of like, security, I guess, or just like verification that needs to be done because of the AI?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about collecting large data sets of, potentially private patient information, we're under the same scrutiny that everyone else is with regards to collecting and storing that information. I think one of the challenges is, if you're looking in a hospital environment, you can put those checks and balances in place, with from a data security perspective pretty easily. But when you're talking about accessing global data sets to build that AI, you need to think about things like informed patient consent. You need to think about where am I storing all this data and how am I accessing it? Am I moving that data? You can't move healthcare data across country borders without breaching data privacy laws. So then how do you access the diverse data that you need to build these things? It's really difficult. And so we've spent a lot of time as a company building the infrastructure or the pipe works to be able to access that data, and we never move or see patient data. So our AI technology around federated AI training allows us to send our AI out to each of those individual siloed data sets and take the learnings from the data without ever moving the data. And so that's how we've overcome some of those data privacy challenges. But yeah, it is really challenging for the AI space.
Yeah, I didn't even think about like what it was like going across borders, because every country's different, I mean, I'm assuming some are more strict than others. Um, so, and for the audience and even for me, if you don't mind, so our next speaker, we actually are going to be delayed a little bit, so we have a little bit more time, so we don't have to stop right at the 35 mark. So with AI, something how when all this data is being inputted into y'all's AI, like how does like what is that process of taking the input in order to provide some sort of output? Like what is like the in between? I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'm trying to
Yeah,
figure
no,
out. So it's just like how because from my understanding, you take all this data in and it looks at it and makes assumptions, based on historical data, right?
yeah. So there's different ways of building AI. It depends on the purpose. What are you trying to build? So if you look at our embryo quality assessment example with Life Whisperer, essentially we took a whole global data set of embryo images at a particular time point from patients actually undergoing the IVF treatment. And then we got the outcomes, so the pregnancy outcomes. Did the patient get pregnant from that particular embryo? So we've got matched outcome data to the embryo data. And then we built the AI based on those images of tens of thousands of historical embryos where we knew what the outcome is. And essentially, that AI then learns the features of those embryos that look more like a good embryo that resulted in a pregnancy versus those features that look more like an embryo that did not result in a pregnancy. and it learns those features. And so when it sees a new embryo image, is very accurately able to tell whether it looks more like one that achieved a pregnancy or not. Same with the genetics product, but instead of pregnancy outcome, we use genetic testing outcomes. So in IVF, you can genetically test embryos. And so we had the actual ground truth outcome for whether those embryos were genetically normal or not. And again, the AI then is trained to look at the images and determine which features relate to an embryo that looks more like one that's genetically normal or not. And so that's essentially how we build that AI.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So I was just informed that we actually do have to stop at the 35-minute mark. But so where can people connect with you offline, and where can they learn more about if they want to learn more about your company and kind of some of the services?
Yeah. Of course. So the website's presagen.com. You can obviously find me on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. I'm very accessible, and you can email me at michelle@presagen.com.
Amazing. Well, I definitely will connect with you. I think I might have already, but thank you so much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure having you. I hope you have a great day.
Of course. Thanks so much.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.